There is a field just south of Jerusalem, tucked into the slope, where the Hinnom Valley bends like a scar across the earth. The locals do not farm it. They do not build on it. They barely speak its name without lowering their voices. They call it Akeldama, the field of blood. It was purchased with 30 pieces of silver coins that no one wanted to touch. Coins that were thrown onto the marble floor of the temple with such force that they scattered and rolled into the cracks between the stones. The priests who picked them up held them like something diseased. "We cannot put this into the treasury," they said. "It is blood money." So they bought a field with it, a burial plot for foreigners, for people with no name, no family, no one to mourn them. And the man who earned those coins, the man who carried them in a pouch against his chest, for less than 48 hours before the weight of them crushed his soul, that man never received a burial in the field, his money paid for. His body was found in that valley, broken, alone, with no one standing over him. No prayer spoken, no oil poured, no stone rolled, just silence, and the slow Judean wind passing through the thorns. His name was Judas Iscariot, and this is not the story of a villain. This is the story of a man who had everything, who walked with God in the flesh, who heard the voice that spoke the stars into existence, who was trusted with a seat at the table and a place in the inner circle, and who lost it all, not in a single dramatic moment, not through some spectacular fall from a great height, but through a series of small, quiet, invisible decisions, each one so minor it barely registered, until the night he leaned in and kissed the one person who had never stopped loving him. And by then, it was already too late. Rewind. 3 years earlier, the dust of Galilee was alive with rumors. A carpenter's son from Nazareth, a town so unremarkable that people joked about it, had begun teaching in the synagogues. And something about his voice stopped people in the middle of their work. Fishermen left their nets half-pulled. Tax collectors looked up from their ledgers. Women carrying water stood still at the well with jars balanced on their heads, listening. His name was Jesus. And he was not simply teaching. He was calling, one by one, name by name. He looked at men no one else would have chosen and said, "Follow me." He called Simon, a fisherman with a temper. He called Andrew, Simon's quieter brother. He called James and John, the sons of thunder. He called Matthew, a tax collector, despised by his own people. He called men with dirt under their fingernails, men with no formal education, men who had never been selected by any rabbi before. And then he called Judas, the son of Simon, from the village of Iscariot, the only one of the 12 who was not from Galilee. He came from Judea, from the south, from a different accent and a different landscape. He was the outsider in a group of insiders. And yet Jesus looked at him and said the same 2 words he had spoken to all the others. "Follow me." What did Judas feel in that moment? The Gospels do not say, but consider what he must have seen. He must have watched Jesus heal the sick, watched a man with withered limbs stretch out his arms and flexed fingers that had not moved in years. He must have stood at the edge of a crowd of 5,000 and watched bread multiply in baskets until there was more left over than they started with. He must have been in the boat the night the storm hit and watched Jesus stand on the bow and speak to the wind the way a father speaks to a child, and the wind obeyed. He saw all of this, every miracle, every sign, every moment that made the other disciples fall to their knees in awe. Judas was there for all of it, and Jesus trusted him of all. 12 men. Judas was the one given charge of the money bag, the common fund that sustained their entire ministry. Every donation, every gift, every coin dropped into their hands by grateful families and healed strangers. It all passed through Judas. He was the treasurer, the keeper of the group's resources. In a culture where financial trust was sacred, this was no small assignment. Jesus did not give this role to Peter, the leader. He did not give it to John, the beloved. He gave it to Judas. That detail matters because it means Jesus looked at Judas and saw someone capable, organized, reliable. And it means Judas, at some point, was exactly that. But something shifted. The Gospel of John, written decades later by the disciple who had been closest to Jesus, pulls back a curtain that the other Gospels leave drawn. John tells us plainly that Judas had begun stealing from the money bag, not dramatically, Not in large amounts that anyone would notice. Small skims, quiet withdrawals, the kind of theft that hides inside routine. A coin here, a coin there, always with a plausible explanation, always beneath the threshold of suspicion. When did it start? No one knows, but the fact that it continued unchecked, cycle after cycle, tells us something devastating about the architecture of spiritual decay. It does not arrive with fireworks. It arrives with silence. It is not a single crack in the wall. It is moisture behind the plaster, rotting the structure so slowly that the wall still looks solid on the morning it collapses. Judas was rotting from the inside, and no one saw it. Perhaps not even Judas himself. The moment that exposes the fracture most clearly happens, not in Jerusalem, but in Bethany, in the home of Lazarus, the man Jesus had raised from the dead 6 days before the Passover. Mary, Lazarus' sister, took a jar of pure nard, an ointment so costly that its value equaled nearly a full year's wages for a laborer. She broke the jar open and poured it over Jesus' feet. The fragrance filled the entire house, and then she knelt and wiped his feet with her hair. An act so intimate, so reckless, so utterly indifferent to the opinions of the room that it silenced everyone. Everyone except Judas. Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? He said. It sounded righteous. It sounded responsible. It sounded like the voice of a man who cared about justice. But John, writing years later, strips the mask away with a single sentence. He said this, not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag he used to help himself to what was put into it. There it is, the rot exposed in one sentence. Judas had learned to dress greed in the language of compassion. He had learned to make selfishness sound like service. And the terrifying thing is, he may have believed his own performance. He may have genuinely convinced himself that he was the reasonable one, the practical one, the one who understood how the world actually worked, while the others chased mystical fantasies. And Jesus, who knew everything, who had known from the very beginning which of the 12 would betray him, looked at Judas and said, "Leave her alone. She has kept it for the day of my burial," the day of his burial. Jesus was already speaking about his own death, and Judas heard it, and it did not register. Or worse, it registered and he dismissed it, because Judas had a different vision of how this story was supposed to end. Many scholars believe that Judas, like many Jews of his generation, expected a political messiah, a king who would overthrow Rome, restore Israel's sovereignty, and establish an earthly kingdom. Every time Jesus spoke about suffering, about being handed over, about dying and rising, Judas may have filtered it through his own expectations and discarded what did not fit. He followed Jesus for 3 years, but he followed the Jesus he wanted, not the Jesus who actually stood in front of him. And then came Passover. Jerusalem during Passover was a city transformed. Josephus, the 1st century historian, estimated that the population swelled to nearly 3 million during the festival. Pilgrims from every corner of the Jewish world flooding through the gates, filling every room, every rooftop, every courtyard. The temple courts were thick with the smoke of sacrifice and the sound of psalms. Roman soldiers lined the walls of the Antonia fortress, watching the crowds with the nervous discipline of men who knew that Jewish festivals had a way of becoming Jewish revolts. Into this pressure cooker walked Jesus, and the tension was unbearable. The Sanhedrin, the supreme religious council, had already decided that Jesus needed to die. Caiaphas, the high priest, had spoken the calculation out loud. It is better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. They had the motive. They had the authority. What they lacked was access. Jesus moved through crowds. He taught in open spaces. Arresting him publicly risked a riot that would bring Roman swords down on everyone. They needed someone on the inside, and Judas walked through their door. Luke's gospel adds a detail that freezes the blood. Then Satan entered into Judas, not whispered to him, not tempted him from a distance. Entered. Whatever internal battle had been raging inside Judas, whatever thin walls still separated calculation from betrayal, it collapsed. And Judas went to the chief priests and the temple guard and asked, "What will you give me if I deliver him to you?" 30 pieces of silver. That was the price. In the economy of 1st century Palestine, 30 silver shekels was the legal compensation for a slave who had been killed, the amount prescribed in the book of Exodus. It was not a fortune. It was not a king's ransom. It was the price of a piece of property. And the prophet Zechariah, writing 500 years earlier, had already named the exact amount. They weighed out for my payment 30 pieces of silver, and God had called it the handsome price at which they valued me. Judas accepted the deal, and from that moment, he looked for an opportunity to hand Jesus over. Away from the crowd, the night arrived. Thursday, the upper room, Jesus gathered his 12 disciples around a low table for the Passover meal, and he knew everything. He knew who would deny him. He knew who would flee, and he knew who would betray him. He got up from the table, wrapped a towel around his waist, poured water into a basin, and began to wash their feet, one by one. The King of the universe, kneeling on the floor, cleaning the dust from the feet of the men who would abandon him before dawn, including Judas. Jesus washed the feet of the man who had already sold him. He held those feet in his hands, he dried them with the towel, and he said nothing about the betrayal. Not yet. Then he sat back down, and his voice changed. Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me. The room went cold. The disciples looked at each other, confused, horrified, each one asking, "Surely not I, Lord." Even Judas asked, "Surely not I, Rabbi." And Jesus looked at him and said, "You have said so." Then came the moment that carries the weight of eternity. Jesus took bread, dipped it, and handed the morsel to Judas. In Jewish custom, offering the dipped bread was a gesture of honor, a sign of friendship, of closeness. Even now, even at this final hour, Jesus extended intimacy to the man who was about to destroy him. And the Gospel of John records what happened next. After he received the morsel, Satan entered into him. Jesus looked at Judas and said, "What you are going to do, do quickly." Judas stood up. He walked to the door. He stepped out into the night. And John adds a line that has echoed through 20 centuries of theology. And it was night. It was night. Not just outside, inside. The Garden of Gethsemane was quiet. Olive trees, older than memory, stood in rows on the slope of the Mount of Olives, their gnarled trunks silver in the moonlight. Jesus had come here to pray, and his prayer was the most anguished recorded in all of Scripture. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." He prayed until his sweat fell like drops of blood, a condition so rare it has a medical name, triggered only by extreme psychological distress. And while Jesus prayed, Judas walked. He came with a crowd, temple guards, officers of the chief priests, men carrying torches, lanterns, swords, and clubs. Judas had given them a sign. "The one I kiss is the man." Seize him. A kiss. In that culture, a kiss was the greeting of a friend, a disciple, a brother. Judas took the most intimate gesture of loyalty and weaponized it. He walked up to Jesus. He leaned in. Ki, Seth, Im, and Jesus, God wrapped in human skin, the author of mercy, the one who could have called down 12 legions of angels with a single word, looked at Judas and said, "Friend, do what you came to do." Friend. He called him friend, not traitor, not enemy, not serpent. Friend. If this story is gripping you right now, if you feel the weight of that word, subscribe, because what happens next is something most people have never truly considered. The arrest happened fast. Peter drew a sword. Jesus stopped him. The disciples scattered into the dark like smoke, and Judas stood there, watching the guards bind the hands that had healed the blind, watching them drag away the man who had washed his feet just hours ago. And somewhere inside him, behind the justification, behind the calculation, behind whatever narrative he had built to make this feel acceptable, something cracked, because Matthew records what happened next with devastating precision. When Judas saw that Jesus had been condemned, when the trial moved forward and the verdict became real, he changed his mind. The Greek word is asterisk, metamelamai, asterisk, not asterisk, metanoia, asterisk, the deep repentance that transforms, asterisk, metamelamai, asterisk, regret, the sickening realization that what he had done could not be undone. He felt the horror, but not the kind that drives a man toward God, the kind that drives a man into himself. He took the 30 pieces of silver, every single coin, and ran back to the temple. He found the chief priests, the same men who had smiled at him, who had counted out the silver, who had shaken his hand and called him useful. He threw the coins at their feet. "I have sinned," he said. "I have betrayed innocent blood." And their response is one of the coldest lines in all of Scripture. 5 words that revealed exactly what Judas had always been to them. What is that to us? See to it yourself. They used him, and when he was broken, they discarded him like a tool that had served its purpose. The religious establishment that had praised his cooperation wanted nothing to do with his conscience. His guilt was his own problem. His soul was not their concern. Judas stood in that temple, the coins scattered on the floor, the priests turning their backs, and realized fully and finally what he had done. Not just what he had done to Jesus, what he had done to himself. He had traded the presence of God for 30 coins that even the priests refused to touch. He had walked away from the table where bread was broken and his feet were washed, and walked into a transaction that bought him nothing. Nothing but a field no one wanted and a name no one would ever speak without a shudder. He left the temple. He walked into the valley of Hinnom Gehenna, the place that served as Jerusalem's smoldering garbage pit, the place that had become a metaphor for hell itself. And there, in that cursed ravine, Judas hanged himself. The book of Acts, narrated by Luke, adds a detail so graphic it suggests eyewitness memory. Falling headlong, he burst open in the middle and all his bowels gushed out. Whether the rope broke, whether the branch gave way, whether the description refers to decomposition, the text does not soften it. Judas's end was not peaceful. It was not dignified. It was the physical manifestation of an internal collapse that had been building for years, and the field bought with his silver was named Aquila, the field of blood. And it remains in the Hinnom Valley to this day, a rocky, barren stretch of land just south of the old city of Jerusalem, where tourists take photographs and tour guides lower their voices. But the tragedy of Judas is not simply that he betrayed Jesus. Many people failed Jesus that night. Peter denied him 3 times before the rooster crowed, cursing and swearing that he had never known the man. Every single disciple fled the garden in terror. Thomas would later refuse to believe the resurrection until he could put his fingers into the nail wounds. Failure was not unique to Judas. Failure was the common thread of everyone who followed Jesus that week. What made Judas different was not the size of his sin, it was the direction of his response. Peter denied Jesus and wept bitterly. He ran to the empty tomb 3 days later. He stood on the shore of the Sea of Galilee and heard Jesus ask him 3 times, "Do you love me?" Once for every denial, and 3 times answered, "Lord, you know that I love you." Peter's failure drove him back to Jesus. Peter's guilt became a doorway, not a wall. Judas's guilt drove him inward, into isolation, into despair, into the terrible conviction that what he had done was beyond repair, that no forgiveness existed large enough, that no grace could reach the place where he stood. And so he did not run toward Jesus. He ran away. He ran to the priests who could not help him. He ran to the valley where no one could find him. He ran into the dark. And that is the razor-thin line that separates Peter from Judas. Not the severity of the sin, but the direction of the response. One man turned toward grace. The other turned away from it. And everything depended on that single pivot. The theological weight of Judas's story has been debated for 2,000 years. Was Judas predestined to betray Jesus? Was he simply fulfilling prophecy, a necessary instrument in God's plan of salvation? If Jesus had to die, did someone have to betray him? And if someone had to betray him, can Judas truly be blamed? These questions deserve honest engagement. The Psalms clearly prophesied the betrayal. Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. Zechariah named the price. Jesus himself said, "The Son of Man goes as it is written of him." The plan of God was sovereign and complete. But Jesus also said this. The words carry a weight that no theological system can fully absorb. Woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. It would have been better if he had not been born in all of Scripture. This is perhaps the most devastating sentence ever spoken about a single human being, and Jesus spoke it not with anger, but with sorrow, because God's sovereignty does not erase human choice. The plan was fixed, but Judas was not forced. At every step, at every fork, at every quiet moment when conscience whispered and greed answered louder, Judas chose. He chose the coins over the community. He chose the transaction over the relationship. He chose the Jesus he wanted over the Jesus who stood before him. And that is why his story is not just ancient history. It is a mirror. Because the tragedy of Judas was not that he was uniquely evil. It was that he was terrifyingly ordinary. He did not betray Jesus with a war cry or a manifesto. He betrayed him with a kiss, with the gesture of a friend. He did not fall from heaven like Lucifer. He drifted slowly, invisibly, one compromised conviction at a time, until the distance between who he was and who he pretended to be became an ocean he could no longer cross. He sat at the table. He heard the teachings. He watched the miracles. He carried the money bag, and none of it saved him, because proximity to Jesus is not the same as surrender to Jesus. Judas proves, with painful clarity, that it is possible to be near the light and still choose the dark. That it is possible to hear the truth every single day and still build an internal narrative that filters it into something more comfortable, more convenient, more aligned with personal ambition. The upper room held 13 men that night. 12 of them would stumble, fail, weep, and return. One would not. The difference was not knowledge. They all had the same knowledge. The difference was not opportunity. They all had the same access. The difference was not even love, because Jesus loved Judas enough to wash his feet, enough to hand him bread, enough to call him friend even in the moment of betrayal. The difference was what each man did with the crack in his soul when it finally split open. The coins still sit in the cracks of the temple floor, in memory, in metaphor, in the conscience of anyone who has ever traded something eternal for something that fit in the palm of their hand. The field still bears its name. And the question that Judas's life leaves behind is not how could he. It is sharper than that, closer than that, more personal than that. It is, what are you holding right now, so quietly, so naturally, so reasonably, that is, slowly, invisibly, pulling you away from the one voice that has never stopped calling your name? Because Judas did not realize it, not when he skimmed the first coin, not when he criticized Mary's offering, not when he shook hands with the priests, not when he walked through the garden with a torch in one hand and a kiss on his lips. He did not realize it until it was too late. And the saddest part of the whole story is this: it did not have to be. The same grace that caught Peter, that restored him on the beach, that turned his denial into a testimony, that grace was available to Judas too. The same Jesus who said, "Friend," in the garden would have said, "Welcome" back at the tomb. The door was never locked. The light was never extinguished. But Judas never turned around, and the field of blood still waits, quiet, barren, untouched, a permanent monument to the most expensive Christ to ever be sold cheaply, and the most devastating proof that the greatest danger is not being far from God, it is being close to Him and still walking away.